thanks for coming out, everyone. My name is Claudina Sarahe. I live in New York City, and I am a systems designer, front-end architect. I consult for a couple companies, primarily this one called Oddbird, where we do a lot of custom tools. And I also help train and bring teams up to speed that are sort of lacking front-end engineers or may have teams that are more junior dev heavy into better, more performant front-end practices. I also organize the Sass and Front-End Meetup out in New York City, and I'm the co-founder of Sass Conf, which is a yearly conference we've held for the past 2 years. This year it's going to be in Austin, Texas in November, and our CFP is open. So for those here that have worked with Sass or the front-end devs here that are interested, please submit. Should be a pretty good time. And I have to admit, so it was cool to do that little survey and see that we do have some front-end people here when they're like, come speak about Sass at this conference for Java developers. I was like, what? Okay, this should be interesting. It's been really cool to chat with some of the people and see that, style sheets affect us all. Let's get started. So really, it's like, why do we even care about this thing called Sass? And why does it matter? And so these are some of the reasons that I've heard about why people use it. And why people are adopting it, or why people have adopted preprocessors in general. For me, really, though, one of the things that I love about Sass is that it actually allows us to design systems in our style sheets. CSS is an incredibly flat and simple language, and that's fine. It's meant to be that way. The web is supposed to be easy. But we have an incredible constraint now with our multi-device world, and CSS just can't keep up with it. You cannot architect and have modular design with CSS. So preprocessors have come along. And there are a couple. There's Less and there's Sass. And then there's also Stylus. And then there's also this new set of post-processors, which are more popular in the Node ecosystem. And each has their benefits and pros and cons. I won't go into that too much. But the main difference I see between Sass and Less is power. Sass, to me, is basically a fully baked programming language for your front end. So you're going to see the same concepts of variables and functions, maps, which are really hashes and arrays, lists, all these tools that you would get in a programming language, you suddenly have access to in your style sheets. So while this is lovely and great, this is a quote. Sorry, this is hard to read up here. It's dark. It says, just as you can't expect everyone who holds a hammer to be a master carpenter, Sass doesn't automatically turn you into a great front-end developer. It's just a powerful tool. Know what you do, and you'll be just fine. So this session's a little short to go into all the sorts of ins and outs of Sass. Sass, to me, is just one set of your front-end tool chain. And there are other tools that help make your life a lot easier when dealing with Sass. The first one that I'm just going to touch on these high level are build tools. So we're thinking here like Grunt and Gulp and Broccoli. I actually highly recommend that if you aren't compiling Sass with Grunt or Gulp, that you look into it and that you add it to your workflow. Because it's not just for compiling Sass, it's all the other benefits that you're going to get. There are linters for your Sass, so it can be nice and clean, and you can enforce coding standards on your team. You can compress and minify your assets easily. One of the big hot new tools out there is called Auto Prefixer. It's an ER there. And that takes care of reading through your output CSS and prefixing it for you, and you can set your browser support chain as necessary. And this is really nice. This means that we don't have to worry about creating Mixins that contain all of the browser prefixes, which was, I feel like, the earlier state of Sass. So really working with these build tools brings a lot of power. There's also the ability to have source maps, which is extremely helpful once you're digging into Sass because you're splitting your code up into different files, but the browser sees it as your main CSS file. So with source maps, you're actually able to, in Chrome, see what file your Sass is directly coming from. Also, we need to manage dependencies. If you are running how many people here are running the Ruby version of Sass? Okay. And how many are using libsass? No one. All right, great. I'll talk about those in a second. Or I'll just go into it. So Sass has two versions. It was originally written in Ruby, and that Sass version right now is at 3.4. And recently, it's been released. There's a new version called libsass, which is a C port of Sass. The wonderful thing about libsass is that it can run anywhere, and it's incredibly fast. To give you an idea, we recently refactored our entire code base. We had 20-second compile times with Ruby Sass. We are now down to under 1 second. So once you start dealing with large amounts of code, I highly recommend switching over to libsass. And right now, the two projects are not necessarily at the same feature set of compatibility, but libsass is under active development. Version 3.2 was released today, and we should start seeing both of these projects come into alignment. There's this wonderful site called Sass Compatibility that basically goes through all the different feature sets of Sass and lets you know in what versions they're actually available, and also provides a nice little workaround if you need it. But I would highly recommend moving to libsass. It makes it really easy to work with Sass in node environments and sort of any environment, which has really been a big win for the community. But if you are using Sass in Ruby, please use a gem file to manage your dependencies. And also, if you're working with Ruby, you want to use a Ruby manager, such as RBM or RMV, and make sure that you're including the version of Ruby that you're using in your code base. If you're not working within that, Bower and NPM, a lot of the Sass extensions have moved into Bower and NPM packages, which is great. So you can easily pull them into your projects. And when you're using Bower and NPM, just make sure to save the dependencies using the or dash capital D or dash save dash dev. A couple other important things, two more important things. Sass is really more than a technology. It's an incredibly vibrant and respectful community. And I think this is also what sets it apart from Less. Less does not have the same ecosystem as Sass does. It does not have the same rich availability of plugins and tools that you can use. Quite honestly, to me, Less grew in popularity because A, it was much easier to install for a while, and B, Twitter Bootstrap adapted it because of that. And so everyone just got used to working with Less. But Twitter Bootstrap now has an official Sass port. I think that one will pretty much start to take over because of the community that Sass has behind it that Less does not. Oops, sorry. And then secondly, it's still CSS at the end of the day. So don't forget your CSS file, especially when you're learning. It's really important to continue to review your CSS file and see what Sass is outputting so you don't end up with a really big mess, which can happen when you're dealing with abstractions. So just remember that, hey, you're doing all this fancy stuff, but it's going to compile back to CSS. All right, let's get into it. So, first things first. This is where I like to start. Organizing your Sass directory. Idiosyncratic. There's no right or wrong way. Everyone has their flavor. But this is sort of what I've been seeing across the community, and it's a system that works for us. So in my Sass directory, I tend to have about 5 other folders. My base folder holds all my configuration in setting Sass partials. These don't tend to generate output. These are like storing variable values, storing things that my application needs. After that, I have a components or a module directory. This is really the largest section of the site. So this would contain things like my blog module, my nav component, my footer component, and I split everything out into partials. We'll take a look at what those are shortly, because it's much easier to maintain, and this is one of the things that Sass gives us. It gives us a way to scale and maintain things and break things apart and not incur any risk or debt and performance debt. The third folder is layout, and layout might not actually contain a lot of files. It really depends how complex your site is. And by layout, I like to just store in layout like the top level regions. So it doesn't contain any style stuff. It basically just sets up the page. So you could have, let's say you have a main content area and a side content area. You would have that layout. You could have your top hero with a split bottom pane. That would be another layout. So I like to break them out there. Patterns are a folder where I put sort of reusable little components that we're creating. And my patterns folder is interesting because at the end of every project, I take a look at it and I go, am I reusing this pattern on other projects? And if so, I pull it out and I make a utility that I tend to, I'll release it, it'll be on GitHub, I'll put it in Bower, because it's something that I use all the time. And this is another major power of Sass, is that you can build tools to make your life easier for authoring CSS down the line. CSS can be tedious, let's make it fast. So if you're starting to notice that you do notifications or alerts on all your, sorry about that, on all your projects, then you can, then you can reuse those at will. Excuse me one second. My team has built a bunch of utilities for handling things like font face mix-ins and how we're handling colors and how we handle icons and these things that we consistently do across all of our projects that we're now able to codify in Sass and make our own little happy tools. And the last one was plugins. I'll wait for this to load. And plugins for me is my vendor folder. So that's where I put any Sass that's coming from external libraries. That's where, if I'm using Bower, I do not commit my Bower components file. Instead, I have some gulp tasks that grab the main files and stick them into my plugins directory. And I know that everything in there is possibly related to some other library. Ooh, this display changed. One second here. Sorry about this, hold on one second. There we go. Okay. Okay, so let's dig into this. Let's start with one of the main benefits that you get from Sass. Partials. Partials, you can always recognize they start with an underscore. And basically what that means is the file is never imported or compiled unless you import it. And as I said earlier, they really allow you to split your CSS into smaller maintainable pieces. Feel free to use them liberally. Don't worry about having too many partials. Just make sure you understand what they're doing. I actually like having smaller little pieces of code. And then to use partials, we import them with this @import. The @ plus command is something that you're going to see a lot in Sass. That's how we define a lot of our mixins and includes and extends. And the great thing about Sass imports is they do not create extra HTTP requests. So unlike CSS imports, these have no performance burden. And so let's take a look here at, this is a Sass directory in one of my projects. As you can see, we have base, components, patterns, and plugins, and then we have our main file. So this is our screen.css file. This gets compiled to screen.css, and this is actually what the browser interprets. And if we open it, you see that all we're doing is importing all of our other stuff here. So this is how I like to keep my main manifest file. It should be very clean. It's pretty much just a big, massive import. And the one thing to remember is that order matters. So base contains, as I said before, is always our main settings and colors. It has to come before, otherwise it'll throw an error if anything else requires it. So I like to do base, then patterns up at the top, followed by any plugins, and then just list out my components afterwards. This is a fairly simple site. The more complex your site is, feel free to leave comments and documentation about what things are doing. It's always super helpful. So digging into some of our files, let's take a look at base. These, we've established this convention, and it's something that I really, really like. It's our own internal one, but I say it every time I give this. We've now started to append our files with .config, which to us is a simple way of noting that this file generates 0 output. It's just holding like configuration and settings. So for example, we can take a look at our colors here. This is a map. We'll get into these later. A map is basically the equivalent of a hash or an array or a Python dictionary. But this doesn't actually output anything unless we call it. We can go to, let's take a look. This is type helpers that we have. These are mixins that help make ellipses easy for us. We tend to create silent extends for some of our header styles so we can reuse them. But that's what our base directory does. It just sets things up. The other folder or file that I really recommend and like to have in my base is a requirements. And requirements is where we import all of those plugins and any of the third-party dependencies. So if you're using any external libraries like Suzy or Foundation or anything like that within it, I would import it here. We are using, this is our own internal library that we built called Accoutrement. It is available for anyone to play around with, and that's what we have here. So I also really like having a requirements file. And then, so our components, this one isn't that big, but if you're following the convention where you have a Sass file, then you've got your templates and your JS, I like to mirror my components to mirror the structure of my templates or views. So if you've got a blog view, I have a folder called blog in here, and all my partials go in there. And that way, it's a lot easier to know what's affecting what. Patterns, things that we're using here on this site that are, so drop-downs. Maybe we might figure out that this is a pattern we want to abstract into something for all of our projects. And then plugins, this is automatically pulled in via our Bower tasks, and then these are other ones that we have. So this is a convention that has been really nice because when you jump on a project, you just know what's going on. And you can pick what works best for your team. Just make sure that you document it, just make sure that you stick to it, just make sure that everyone understands that it's there, and it's not willy-nilly. The worst thing that you can do, I think, is just throw all your partials into one file and one folder and expect people to understand what's going on. Okay, so now we're going to dig into variables, the difference between mixins and extends, when to use them, why you may want to and not want to. We'll take a look at some color functions, 2 of the control directives, nesting, and the ampersand. So let's start with mixins and extends. Okay. A mixin in Sass is a way to share reusable pieces of code. And this is how you declare a mixin. You simply write @mixin and you give it a name. So this one is called solid block. And then within it, you can pass in whatever you want. So let's say we've got this background that's blue, a color is white, it's padding, and font size 3M, right? But I have nothing in my compiled CSS. Nothing is showing up. I've declared this thing, but this thing isn't doing anything. So how do we use a mixin? To call a mixin, you have your selector, and you use the @include syntax and call the name of the mixin. And now you can see on the right that, container blue has showed up, and it has all these lovely properties. So this is really nice. Let's say you have another container. Let's call this one pink, right? And it's basically the same thing. You want this solid block. Great, you get that again. This avoids duplication. So when you go back through your CSS file, if you see that you're repeating chunks of code over and over and over again, that's a wonderful sign that maybe you should break it down into a mixin, right? But what is actually really powerful about these mixins? Because this is great, like, cool, I can pass this around, but I'm not really doing much with it. And secondly, like, my blocks might not always have blue backgrounds. I want this to change depending on if it's pink or if it's yellow, right? So the power of mixins is the following. They accept arguments. And to declare that you're going to pass in arguments, you put the brackets in, and then you can pass in as many arguments as you want. And so let's say we're going to give this an argument for background color, right? I'm going to call $background. That's the name that I'm going to name this variable, this argument. The $sign followed by any form of text is a variable in Sass. So to set it, all right, so we've got this variable, and now we can pass it in. So now we can replace what we want in our mixin to be controlled by the variable. Shoot, now I've got this error. It's saying mixin solid block is missing the argument. So when you're passing in parameters to your mixin, if you do not define a default, it always means that you have to call it whenever you're calling the mixin, you have to pass in that default. So let's fix it down here. We want this to be blue, and we want this one to be pink. Aha! Now you can see that it's outputted this blue background, and for container pink, the background is pink. This is wonderful. This is really nice. You can start to see how this becomes incredibly powerful for you to reuse blocks of code where one thing may change, okay? But let's say now that we also want to adjust our color. So we'll go ahead and add another argument. Pass it in here. This is going to be color. And this time we're going to set a default because sometimes we might want to change the color, but most of the time it's white. So to assign a default, you just put the colon and whatever you want that value to be. In this situation, it's white. And you can see that our error went away because there's a default assigned to it. So Sass doesn't care anymore that even though we're calling solid block down here and we've only passed in one argument, it knows, it's okay, color can come. So now let's say we want this to be gray, and we'll leave the other one as white. It's changed over there on the right-hand side. One tricky thing, order matters in terms of defining your arguments, whether or not, if you're passing in a default, you'll notice that you get an error. The required argument must always come before any default arguments are set. That is just a picky thing that Sass does. So make sure that all your required arguments come first, and then your optional arguments can follow afterwards. Okay? So now let's talk about extends, which are, in effect, very similar to Mixins. They allow you to, once again, share blocks of code. So to declare an extend, this is one of the only Sass features that doesn't really start with an at declare extend when you're setting it up. It starts with a percentage sign, and these are called silent extends or placeholder extends. If you've worked with less, you know that you can extend a class, and that works. You can do that in Sass. I'm going to show you why that is dangerous and why you should just always use these silent extends if you use them. But now, okay, so now I've got solid block as an extend. Let's go down here to our pink container, and let's include it. To use an extend, it's the at directive followed by extend, followed by the percent sign, and then you call it. So here it is down here, our container pink, same thing. So one of the main things that's different from extends to Mixins is extends don't take arguments. So you cannot pass in anything. This will always be the same chunk of code, which is fine. But here's their power. Let's say that we have this other container. Instead of outputting two code blocks, it's chained my selectors. So the result is, it's as if in CSS, as if you're just chaining a bunch of selectors to your properties. Honestly, the debate is out what is actually more performant at the end of the day. If you are gzipping and minifying your files, gzip loves repeated code. It compresses that down to nothing. So, in terms of maintainability and to avoid some of the errors and problems that can happen with extends that we'll go through right now, I actually recommend using Mixins whenever possible. Default to a Mixin over an extend unless you really need to. As I showed earlier, we tend to use extends for typographic styles so that we don't have to, in our HTML, do things like add a class called h1. We'll just extend the style h1. But we really have minimized our use on extends just because the trade-offs are up in the air. So let's start to see what can be a little bit dangerous with extends and why we might not want to use them. So we've got container pink and container yellow. Let's create our new one. It's purple. But it's this time it's going to extend purple. You know, purple is the same as container yellow. We want purple to extend container yellow. So it's fine. You see that it's just appended the selector to the top, which is okay. But now, let's say that you're working on a team of multiple people, And your developer doesn't realize that you've decided to actually extend the class container yellow and has come in here and decided to add a bunch of other stuff to the yellow container. We add some content, adds a giant font size. Now we have this, which is incredibly problematic because now our container purple selector has inherited all this other stuff from container yellow that we did not actually want it to inherit. So this is the danger with extends. When you're extending classes. Okay? So this is why if you're using an extend, I would never, ever, 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 ever extend a class. Just use extends and make sure that you're using the silent percentage. All right? Any questions about mixins or extends before I go on? Yes? So the question is, can you include CSS selectors and mixins? All right, so let's go up here. If I'm understanding your questions correctly, you want something like solid block, and then let's go with block title, font size 2M, something like this? Yes, you can. Let me uncover that for you. So there you go. Container blue, and then it outputs container blue dot block title 2M. So you can nest. This is a concept in Sass called nesting, where you can, and we could even do this. Block title, let's say there's an anchor tag in there. So now it's output dot container blue dot block title anchor tag color purple. So this concept of being able to write selectors within their brackets, this is called nesting. Nesting is incredibly powerful and should not be abused. You do not want to nest more than 3 to 4 selectors deep. In fact, if you're writing really good class names, another thing that we're starting to do is to not really resort to nesting unless we're using them for pseudo selectors. And what I mean by that is Sass has a very powerful feature that we call the MagicalAmpersand, which is otherwise better known as the parent reference. So let's say I want to add hover to this. I am now nested within my anchor tag. Bring this up. And I can add a hover, and on hover, I want this to have the color blue. And this is what Sass outputs. So I like to use the parent selector, the MagicalAmpersand, when I'm dealing with pseudo selectors. And I like to use nesting for pseudo selectors. It's a lot cleaner. Show you some other things that you can do with the ampersand. Okay, so this is the block title block. I'm now within this. What is my ampersand going to refer to? Does anyone take a guess? Block title and the parent, right? So dot container dot block title. So say I do ampersand, and now I have a block photo. You can see here that it's appended block photo. It's I'll show you some more examples with the ampersand and when you want to use it. It's got the other main sort of powerful thing about it is it doesn't matter where it goes. So now I've created a class that's block photo dot container blue selector block title because I've placed it at the end and it's referring to the parent. All right, any other questions about mixins or extends? No. Going once. Going twice. Okay. So again, for a Mixin, flexible, reusable blocks of code. Your required arguments must come before any optionals. We didn't do this, but I really like declaring arguments on their own line. So you can have a Mixin that actually requires a lot of arguments. For readability, it can be helpful to do something like this. Yep. If both arguments have defaults? Great question. If you only... You want BG to have a default, right? Okay, so BG's default is blue. Okay? So when we're declaring it, Nope, you don't have to. It's smart enough to, Sass is smart enough to know. Okay, so the question, I'm going to comment this out so it's easier to see. The question is, what happens if if all your Mixin arguments have defaults and all you want to do is target the second one? So what you have to do is, you don't put a comma, but if you're targeting the second one, you actually have to be explicit and declare what you're setting it to. So in this case, it's color. Otherwise, if I don't, Sass just goes in order and it says, that's the background. All right? So it's also just good to get into the habit sometimes of actually passing in the name of the argument into your Mixin. It saves everyone the hassle of guessing and having to go back to your documentation. Great question. Any other questions? Okay. So we talked about extends. It's really reusing code without adding any extra bloat to your CSS file. But again, gzip, minify, compress, it'll be okay. Use wisely and carefully. All right, let's talk about functions and also do a little bit more refactoring work here on some notifications. And I will be asking for some participation here so we can scream things out. Okay, this is a module that we tend to see on many of our sites. We have these things called notifications or alerts. And we tend to have multiple of them. We have success, we have warnings, and they share a lot of reusable code. So here you can see that we have our base sort of class notification that is setting things up. And then every time that we have a new notification with a new color, we're declaring a bunch of values again. So this, immediately, when I see this in a CSS file, I'm like, things that can be refactored. This looks like the same declaration over and over and over again. So these are both great candidates for Mixins. One other thing that you'll notice here, and we'll talk, and this will come into our functions, Sass allows you to use a wide range of color manipulations, and you don't have to use just hex or RGB. I like HSL. How many people here are familiar with HSL? Okay, a little bit. Basically, the color wheel is a spectrum from 0 to 360. So this is the first value, and then you get lightness and brightness, and you can control them. So what's really neat is that Sass provides functions for adjusting each of these, so you can take one color value, which we'll see here, and be able to generate like a nice set of different colors, which is, again, one of Sass's another great thing is that you don't have to have a file that has, like color main or color border, color bottom. You can really use its color functions to generate it. And if you're interested in seeing all the awesome color functions that Sass has, Jackie Balzer, this is jackiebalzer.com/color, or just Google Sass and Compass color functions. She goes through all of them and provides you really awesome examples of how they work and what they do. You can change these two colors here at the top, and then this just shows you the output of exactly what you're getting. If you view the full documentation, she shows you how to use it. So it's a wonderful way of digging through what's available in the color functions. Okay, but let's get back to our refactoring here. So, first things first, how to approach this. So there are really two things that we see here. We have the structure of the notification, and then we have the style of the notification. So I like to separate that out into two separate mixins. You could do one giant one, but again, harder to maintain. So let's start by creating one for the structure. So how do we create a mixin? At Mixin, right. Okay, so let's call this one notification structure. Bingo. All right, and let's look in here what things we could pass. So border radius, let's get rid of that. That can go in there. What else can go in here? This is pretty much the same. We're not going to change the fonts much. Oops, daisies. Did that just go away? Looks like I just got rid of that. This is a problem of incognito. Okay, back here. Notification structure. All right, so we had moved border radius. We had moved our font family. And what else can we remove from here? Line height, text transform, padding. These all look like structural things that we can get rid of. Wonderful. So now we need to include this notification structure into our actual notifications, because now they mean nothing. So now we can call, how do we call our mixin? At include. And we can see that that's passing through. Wonderful. So we've got our structure. Now let's create another one that deals with color. So once again, notification color. And this is where we'll pass in all the color thing, the styles that are getting manipulated. And now we'll replace these. And I'll save this because this is okay. So now we've set it up where we have these two mixins. One is for structure and one is for color. But this isn't pretty fun because we have info and alert. We actually need our color mixin to accept some arguments, right? So we could have it accept 4 different arguments. We could say we want to set a color, a background color, a border, and a text shadow, but that's really unmanageable. We're going to have it accept 1 argument only, and we're going to use functions to generate the rest. So the only argument that this is going to accept is a color. And I will go ahead and set it to this. So here's where we can start using variables. To define a variable, it's a $sign. Let's call this base color. This is our new base color, and we'll set color to base color. And now I need to make sure that there we go. So everything is happy-dappy here. It's going to convert it to the RGB colors. But so we have our base, and then let's create a couple others. We have this. We have our alert color, which is this. A little bit different. So alert color. And that gets a variable. And now down here, we can go ahead and pass in alert color. Great. So how do we generate and test for these values? Basically what is happening, write a little HTML here. Oops. Info and success. Notification. Spelling. There we go. Notification success. Notification info. Alert. There we go. There's alert. And here is info, and info needs a color. This one be the base. Okay. Oh, looks like there's a... you're right. I called what? I passed in the value incorrectly. It should be color. Thank you. There we go. Alrighty. So now let's work on creating our function that is going to handle generating all of this other stuff. For purpose of time, I am going to copy paste one that is already done, and we'll work from there. Okay, so much like any of the other directives in Sass, function starts out by declaring the @ function, and this says that, hey, we're about to start a function here. And then we give it a name. So in this case, we want to call this one set notification text color. And it's going to take an argument, and in this case, we're going to pass in the color. So what we want to do is we want to be able to test the different values of our color. If it's a lighter background, we want to darken the color. If it's a darker background, we want to lighten the color. So Sass also has handy control directives where you can test and return different values. So here we're saying at if, and this is a function lightness that Sass gives you. So if the lightness of the color is greater than 80, then we want to return our color, but we're going to adjust one of the properties. We're going to adjust the lightness so that it is darker. Otherwise, we're going to return our color, and we're going to make some other adjustments so that our text color is a little bit lighter than everything else. Adjust color is, again, one of the built-in color functions, and with HSL, it lets you individually adjust any of the different properties, so the hue, the lightness, or the saturation. Again, if you refer to take a look at this, you can see that you can do that with RGBA as well. You can mix them. You can specifically darken or lighten. You could just adjust the red or the blue. You can pick what property of the color that you want. So now we have our function that works. And the way that we use functions a little bit differently than Mixins, which we just kind of pass in all at once, we will go to our notification color. And what we want to change is, actually this should be this. We're setting background color. What we want to change is our text color. So to call a function, here we would say set notification text color, mouthful of a function. All right. And then we just pass in color. So this is how functions work. When you see functions, they are always passed in after the property that you are changing. So HSLA, this HSL function, this is actually a function. And you can see that adjust color is a function. So functions are used to return values. Much like in programming, you probably want to pare it down so that your function returns one value only. But they can be really great for things like creating percentages on the fly, or anything that you want to return a value. People use them for converting pixels to ems instantly. When you're debating between functions and mixins, if your mixin is really only like returning one thing, you can try to see if you can refactor it into a function. All right, so now let's take a look at some of these and play around. If we base color, notification, all right. So if we take a look, just to review what we've done here, our notification color, or actually the juicy stuff of this, we pass in one variable, which is just our color. We set that to our background. We're generating our text color off of that. And you can also do a bunch of other things where you can generate let's just use this here. If you wanted to tweak your border color in any certain way, or your text shadow, you could do that. But for now, we'll just work on the text color that is actually changing. So if this is 90, let's see what happens. You can see that that becomes lighter, and this becomes darker instantaneously. This is 10. You can see how I can see my text color. So this is a really fun way of creating these really dynamic pieces of code that handle all the logic for you. So I would definitely recommend playing around with the Sass color functions and seeing how you can get yourself down to creating and generating a bunch of colors by defining one color only. Any questions on functions or this refactoring for Mixins? Nope. Okay. Cool. So again, the magical ampersand that we touched on briefly. Just going back here and kind of keeping it very simple so you can see. Magical ampersand is our parent selector, so it's always going to refer to the parent. Because there is nesting, this is equivalent to this. It doesn't change. But if I were to put this selector at the end, who wants to take a guess what my new selector will be? There we go. Block title, container blue. So a powerful little helper there for referring and grabbing whatever you need from the parent. All right, let's take a look at our last set here, which is maps, lists, and control directives. The Sass documentation actually does a really good job of documenting all the built-in functions. So lists come with their own set of functions for accessing values, and maps come with their own set of functions. The slightly confusing thing is that map functions can also use the list functions. You'll wrap your head around that as you work with it. For now, let's take a look at an example with both. This is a little helper that we've built for handling z-index. Z-index is one of those pesky little things that you start to look into your CSS file and all of a sudden you've got like z-index 9,000 and z-index 10,000 here, and you have no idea how to manage what's going on. So I'm going to show you two z-index examples. The first is using a map and the second is using a list. And you can let me know which you think is more performant. So a Sass map is defined by giving the map a name. In this case, our map is called z-index. And then we have a colon and a parenthesis where we start writing our hash. So this is our key and this is our value. It's very similar to any array that you're going to see in a program in any other language. So we give it a name. We have a few here. We've got a z-index for just bumping things a little bit higher. We've got a canvas one, an overlay. Give them names that are helpful. This is actually some of the benefits of using this. You can name things in a way that makes sense. Ah, I get it. Messages, not 9,000. And then to access our z-index, we've created a function. And the reason that we've created a function to do this is because if we didn't, every time that we would want to use our z-index, we would have to do something like this. We would have to say map get, which is the Sass function for retrieving values from your map, pass in the map that we want. In this case, it's z-index. And then we would pass in the layer that we want. And in this case, let's say we want sortable. So it prints this out for me. But this will get really tedious and annoying if every time I want to use z-index, I have to call map get. So this is, again, where functions become super helpful. We create a simple function for ourselves. The function a name. In this case, it's z-index. and it's going to take one value only. We just want to pass in the layer. I don't care what this number is. I just want to pass in the number and the name and get the number out. This is really just a helper and a consideration when you're writing functions, as in any other language. We want to throw a nice, helpful warning message. Otherwise, we don't really know what's going on. So if I didn't have that, and I did this, wrong number of arguments, 1 for 2 for map get. How unhelpful is that? It's not very helpful. So when you're creating functions, the other thing to remember is to add a warning to let people know if something is missing. So here we have, if the map, in this case, okay, I'll have to show it when we actually get there. In this case, what we're doing is we're saying that when we call this function, if the map does not have the layer, spit out this warning that says, oops, we didn't find this layer in the map. This right here is how we interpolate variables in strings so that it actually prints the value of the variable and not it doesn't print layer. I'll show you this in practice soon. So we've declared our function, and all we're going to return from the function is basically what we're typing here. We want to pull from the map z-index the value of the layer. So to use this, instead of calling map get, now we just call the name of our function z-index, and I can pass in what I want, sortable. And it gives me the value for sortable. If I don't pass anything in this time, function z-index is missing the argument for layer. So nice. Or if I pass something in that doesn't exist, like house. Oh, it didn't warn me. That's funny. That looks like a bug in Sass. All right. Well, I'll have to file that. Should warn you. But now you can see that we have this nice little handy method here of grabbing our z-index, and any time that we need to add a new z-index value, we can extend our map. So this is okay. It works. This is a little sore to the eyes when you're reading it. Z-index sortable. So we thought, how can we clean this up, and what can we use so that we don't have to constantly be declaring these values? Here's where a list can become helpful. Let's take a look at this other method for z-index. In this case, we're creating a list. And a list looks very similar to a map, with the exception that it's just comma value separated, or comma value separated items. So we don't have this key value structure before. But the great thing about lists is that every item in the list has an index, which means that it has a number. So this is the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and so forth. And what we've done here is, instead of creating a function, we decided to go ahead and create this as a mixin called z-index. So anytime that we want to use it, instead of having to write something that's redundant, z-index sortable, we can just say @include z-index, which is a lot easier and more readable on the eyes. A lot of deciding whether or not you want to use a function over a mixin over extends comes down to the authoring and reading experience of your code. Look at it and be like, how legible is this? How easy is it to maintain and type? So let's step through this. We're creating a new mixin here called z-index. It's going to accept here a layer, in this case, any one of these, And it also has another argument, which is the list. Since we only have one list in this case, we're going to set it to the default. And here we're using the index function. The index function in Sass returns the position of the list. So we can see here, returns the position of a value within a list. You pass it the list, and it gives you the value. So our Mixin is just going to output z-index. It's going to output the actual CSS. And here we're calling that index function. Give us the list. Take this list value, which is z-index, and please give us the layer. So now we can just use @include. And instead of these giant numbers, we're going to get whatever position this value is in the list. In this case, it's 7. So the really cool thing, what we found out why we preferred to do our z-index this way is z-index, this number of 9,000 or these numbers that we tend to see in our CSS, they're actually purely arbitrary. As long as you just know and order your list accordingly by which element needs to be the highest above, this takes care of it for you. And instead of having to give it a key and give it a value and remember what these values are, the only thing now by using a list, you just have to remember which should come first and which should be higher than what. So now let's say overlay needs to be the highest of them all. I can just move it to the bottom of my list, and now we can see that it's so sortable changed, and overlay is now 7. Let's say we don't need overlay to be 7, and we want it to be the first thing. Overlay is now 1. Any questions about lists and maps in this context? Okay, let's work through a few other examples, which I think will be helpful for sort of driving these in. Or actually, one more. Let's do one more directive. So there's the for and the each directive. So as I mentioned before, some of the other good things that Sass is good for is for taking care of generating tedious amounts of code for us. If you see something like this in your file, this is from a pull request that I got, that I was reviewing, and I was like, oh. And they put a note above it, and their note said, refactor this into a Mixin. And I wrote back, how does this get refactored into a Mixin? There's no way. There's nothing really interesting about this. We're just, in this case, this is from SVG, so these were setting some colors. What we should be doing is never, ever, ever writing code like this again, because we don't have to. So let's look at the for directive, and we'll play around with this and see how it can be used with lists as well. So I want to use Sass to generate all this code for me. So what I'm going to do is basically say, all right. So for some value from this number 2 through, well, here I have 18. There are 18 paths. I want Sass to output stuff for me. So what I want it to do is to basically build these classes. So I'll grab this to start. And now this is where I can have fun replacing it. So this is where we make use of the interpolator for our variables. Otherwise, if we don't, If we don't, we'll get an error. So if I don't interpolate I, my classes that are generating are just I. So I need to interpolate this variable. And now we can see that Sass has done all the hard work for us and generated all of our classes. And now we can easily change these if we need to, from 1 through whatever number you want, 20. Boom. Classes. We've now gone from 20 lines of code to 5. So you can also iterate through lists. So how do we define a list? Are we running? Okay. Cool. Well, let me quickly show iterating through this list. Let's say we have a list of animal, bear, cake. So for the value, this is where I like to use the each function, which is basically for each of the So you can also iterate through lists, which is a really, again, a nice way for generating classes, just things that share the same, classes that sort of share the same selectors that you need. Let me start again. Selectors that share the same properties but are a little bit different. You can easily iterate through them and build out all the code that you need. So this is another really simple way of looking through your CSS and seeing, oh, can I encapsulate this? Can I let Sass generate this stuff for me? If we were doing a map, for maps as well, you would access it with the each function. The only difference is that we would do something like for each key and value in a map. And then that would let you show you quickly. Say we have our z-index map. And here we want our key. And this we want as our value. And it's not map, we called it z-index. Sass generates all the code for us. This is really handy for things like colors, if you have color configuration, or icons, or anything like that. You can store it in this configuration and print it out. All right. I think we're short on time for questions, but I'm happy to stay afterwards and answer questions for anyone. If you want to tweet at me on Twitter, my handle is @itsmisscs. I am happy to send you tons of resources and tons of helpers for things that you might have questions, people that you should follow. Please just let me know. There's lots of people that are willing to help you through this, and I myself am willing to jump on Hangouts. So yeah, please just come up if you have questions, and I'm happy to answer them afterwards. Otherwise, thank you so much.